Hello and welcome to Auspol Explained. I'm your host David. I'm here to explain everything to do with Australian politics, and today's episode is all about comparing the voting records of Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese, the current leaders of the Liberal and Labor Party. So this will help you understand what the two parties are like, what they've voted on, and maybe help you in your decision when you go to the polls later this year. Members of a party usually vote all the same way on a certain issue, not all the time, but comparing the voting records of Albanese and Morrison will give you a pretty decent reflection of what these two parties are like. So to do this, I'm going to use theyvoteforyou.org.au, which has a bunch of voting records of members of parliament. So you can also use it to look up your local member or a senator and compare the different parties and what they have actually voted for. Sometimes political campaigns are misleading. Sometimes there are actually genuine reflections of who the person is. So let's dive deeper and see what these two people are like. So I'm not going to do a complete side-by-side comparison, but what I'm going to do is pick out a couple of topics and compare a few things. So the first one is climate change. Let's start with Scott Morrison. Let's put renewables into They Vote For You. Let's see. So we can see that he has voted generally against the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and he's also voted almost always against increasing investment in renewable energy. It also has a section for we can't say anything concrete about how a person has voted because people are not always in the chamber, they're not necessarily always recorded in divisions. So we also can't say if Morrison has concretely voted for a fast transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, simply because he has not voted on issues of that. So they're actually like lumping these things into like sometimes broad categories. So if we click on a fast transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, we can learn more about what that actually means. So there have actually been 42 relevant divisions according to this site. So if we click on 42 relevant divisions, it brings up all sorts of things about the different votes about, renewable energy, amendments, climate change, etc. Okay, so let's compare Anthony Albanese. The rest of this will go quicker, I promise. So renewable, let's see. So we see that he has voted consistently for a fast transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, voted almost always for increasing investment in renewable energy, and we also see voted generally for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. Let's put carbon in. Okay, so we see that Morrison has voted consistently against a carbon price and has also voted against carbon farming. He's also voted consistently against the carbon pollution reduction scheme. So if we go over to Anthony Albanese and put in carbon, we will find he has voted consistently for a carbon price, voted for carbon farming, and voted for the carbon pollution reduction scheme. Again, I encourage you to click on these things, learn more about them. So the next topic, health. Let's see what they have voted for. So Morrison has consistently voted for increasing the Medicare levy to pay for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and increasing the price of subsidised medicine. Anthony Albanese has voted consistently against expanding Medicare-funded dental care. That is also not recorded on Morrison's voting record, according to this site. Anthony Albanese, on the other hand, has consistently voted against increasing the Medicare levy to pay for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and against increasing the price of subsidised medicine. Morrison has voted consistently against decreasing the private health insurance rebate, and Anthony Albanese has voted consistently for decreasing the private health insurance rebate. So let's move on to other government services like welfare. Let's see. So Scott Morrison has voted consistently for decreasing availability of welfare payments and drug testing of welfare recipients. He's also voted consistently for putting welfare payments onto cashless debit cards or indue cards for an ongoing basis, whereas Anthony Albanese has consistently voted against putting welfare recipients onto cashless debit cards. Anthony Albanese has voted almost always against decreasing the availability of welfare payments and has voted consistently against drug testing welfare recipients. Let's dive into education. So we have Scott Morrison voting consistently for charging postgraduate research students fees. Morrison has voted generally against increasing funding for university education and has voted against increasing the funding for vocational education, and voted generally for increasing the cost of humanities degrees. Whereas Anthony Albanese has voted consistently against charging postgraduate research students fees, he has voted consistently for increasing funding for vocational education, and voted almost always for increasing funding for university education, whereas he has voted against increasing the cost of humanities degrees. Workers and jobs. So, Scott Morrison has voted consistently for getting rid of Sunday and public holiday penalty rates, whereas Anthony Albanese has consistently voted against getting rid of Sunday and public holiday penalty rates. Morrison has voted generally for increasing scrutiny of unions and voted consistently against increasing trade union powers in the workplace, whereas Anthony Albanese has voted consistently against increasing scrutiny of unions, whereas he has voted consistently for increasing trade unions' powers in the workplace. On the topic of disability, Scott Morrison has voted consistently against a Royal Commission into Violence and Abuse against people with disability, whereas Anthony Albanese has voted consistently for a Royal Commission into Violence and Abuse against people with disability. As for the pension, Scott Morrison has voted generally against increasing the age pension, whereas Anthony Albanese has generally voted for increasing the age pension. Let's talk about political transparency. So, Scott Morrison has voted consistently against restricting donations to political parties, whereas Anthony Albanese has consistently voted for restricting donations to political parties. A big topic of discussion over the past several months has been a federal ICAC, or Independent Anti-Corruption Commission. Now, if we compare the records for Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese, we actually see that both of them have the same thing, which says we can't say anything concrete about how they voted on this issue. That is because a federal ICAC bill has not actually been introduced into the House of Representatives. Now, this is the only thing that I'm going to give a bit more of actual context to. This is also a great way to explain how this website works, and also, federal parliament. So there are two chambers, the House of Representatives, where government is formed. That's where Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison sit. There is also the Senate. Both parties have been talking about a federal ICAC for years now. There's been a lot of focus and discussion over the past several months. We do know, actually, fun fact, that a federal ICAC bill passed a few years ago in the Senate. That was a Greens bill that was introduced and was given support by Labour. The coalition in the Senate voted against it. But because Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison aren't in the Senate, they did not vote on that bill. The Liberal Party does have a draft of a federal ICAC bill that they simply have not introduced in the previous parliament that has just been dissolved. They could have near the end, but according to the Liberal Party, they decided to introduce the religious discrimination bill instead and have a vote on that because they thought it had a better chance of passing. The way that this website, theyvoteforyou.org.au, works is it doesn't just take one vote and then just be like, that's their position. It sort of accumulates multiple votes on a category and then sort of weights them as to whether or not this means they're mostly for or generally for or against, etc. So if we click on the Creating an Anti-Federal Corruption Commission, we can see here that there isn't actually much information about this because there's only actually been one division or vote on this topic. It was a private member's business. It was a call for bipartisan support on a federal independent commission against corruption. When something says it's a private member's such and such, that means that it was referring to a member of parliament who isn't a government minister. So if we actually expand this vote from 2nd of December 2019 in the House of Representatives, it was introduced by the independent Andrew Wilkie. This isn't a fully fledged bill. This is a motion. He's just calling for support and asks for members to state whether or not they support a federal ICAC or not, and it did not pass. So you can actually see how people voted for this. So we can see Greens voted yes, all of Labour voted yes, 91% turnout. That also includes Anthony Albanese, and all the members of the coalition that were present voted against it, which includes Scott Morrison. And because they introduced the religious discrimination bill instead of the ICAC, we are going to examine LGBTQIA+ issues. So we can see Scott Morrison has voted consistently for a same-sex marriage plebiscite, and also voted for civil celebrants having the right to refuse to marry same-sex couples. Whereas he has voted consistently against same-sex marriage equality, and we can't say anything concrete about how he's voted on extending government benefits to same-sex couples. Whereas Anthony Albanese has voted consistently for extending government benefits to same-sex couples. He's voted very consistently for same-sex marriage equality. He voted consistently against a same-sex marriage plebiscite. Instead, Labour called for the vote to just happen in Parliament instead of having a public vote on it. And he has also voted against civil celebrants having the right to refuse to marry same-sex couples. Scott Morrison has voted consistently against increasing legal protections for LGBTI people, whereas Anthony Albanese has voted a mixture of for and against increasing legal protections for LGBTI people. I think that's the first time we've actually had that category. Anthony Albanese has also voted a mix for and against transgender rights, whereas Scott Morrison voted consistently against transgender rights. And finally, we're going to finish on refugees. So, Scott Morrison has voted consistently for banning mobiles and other devices in immigration detention. He's also voted consistently against ending immigration detention on Nauru. Just a bit of clarification, immigration is a broad term, so these aren't people in the same category as, like, you know, people on a temporary visa, like backpackers who have come here and do a little bit of work while they're here. These are actually genuine refugees. Morrison has also voted consistently against removing children from immigration detention, whereas Anthony Albanese has voted consistently for removing children from immigration detention. He's voted generally for ending immigration on detention on Manus Island and Nauru, and has voted consistently against banning mobiles and other devices in immigration detention. Scott Morrison has voted consistently for turning back asylum boats when possible. Anthony Albanese, on the other hand, has voted consistently against turning back asylum boats when possible. Scott Morrison has voted generally against implementing refugee and protection conventions, whereas Anthony Albanese has generally voted for implementing refugee and protection conventions. And the final thing, Scott Morrison has voted consistently against doctor-initiated medical transfers for asylum seekers, and Anthony Albanese has voted consistently for doctor-initiated medical transfers of asylum seekers. I want to end it on there because this is actually a very good example of how Parliament works and the importance of choosing who you vote for and the differences between the two chambers. So a lot of people have this idea that voting for a minor party or independent is a complete waste of time because they'll never form government. That's not actually true, and everyone who is in Parliament is deeply important. Like I mentioned earlier, you can actually have a private member's motion or bill to introduce something, like Andrew Wilkie, Independent, did. This medical transfer issue is about Medivac, as it was called. The Independent Karen Phelps won Malcolm Turnbull's seat of Wentworth in the by-election when he resigned from Parliament after Morrison took over as Prime Minister, and because the Liberal National Coalition only had 76 seats before they lost it, that meant they were in a minority, but Karen Phelps gave them confidence and supply, which meant that they could continue to govern. However, she introduced a private member's bill. It actually allowed doctors, instead of a minister, to be able to assess whether or not a refugee needed medical care and then take them from Manus or Nauru to Australia to get that proper medical care that could only be delivered here. There was a big debate in the House, but with the support of Labour, Greens and the other independents, as well as Karen Phelps, the government was outvoted, which almost never happens because the government is meant to have a majority. So that is an example of how, even though a party forms government, they might still lose a vote. But then, also, when the Morrison government won again in 2019, they then went to repeal Medivac, having regained a working majority without the support of independents. But a bill has to pass in both houses, and the government doesn't normally control the Senate, so with Greens and Labour both opposing repealing Medivac, they had the same amount of votes as the coalition in the Senate, and so it's up to the other minor parties and independents. And it came down to a single vote, and that was Jackie Lambie, an independent senator from Tasmania. So while who forms government is incredibly important, it is also important to remember that you are voting for multiple chambers and multiple people. It's also important to know that also who the minor parties and independents get in also are important. So think about your preferences, think about if you're a major party supporter, what minor parties and independents you want to preference second. Your opinion counts, and so whether you support Labour, Liberal, Nationals, or a minor party, it still matters, and I encourage you all to make sure that your details are up to date and vote. I will also be doing a follow-up comparison between the various different minor parties, so you'll be able to compare major parties and minor parties as well. And there you have it. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I hope this has been very helpful to you. Please share so other people can understand the differences between the two political parties. A lot of people get really disengaged and think that they're completely the same, which is not true. There are definitely some similarities, there is definitely more detail, but this is just a good starting point to compare how the two leaders of the major parties differ. Thank you so much. Get excited because the election is coming soon, and I will see you next time.